It was late spring when Andrew first suggested the trip. We were at a barbecue, the kind that turns into a lazy Saturday of beers and idle chatter. The sky had just started shifting into that soft pink hue of dusk, and the smell of grilled meat still lingered in the air. Andrew, always the outdoorsman, was on his second or third beer when he casually mentioned it. "Man, we should do a camping trip. Backcountry. Real outdoor stuff. Not the drive your car to a campsite nonsense." He took a long swig from his bottle and grinned at me, his eyes gleaming with that familiar spark of excitement that he always got when he talked about nature. I laughed it off at first, assuming it was one of those ideas that sounded good when you were half-buzzed but would fade by the next morning. Andrew and I had been friends for years, and while I appreciated his love for the wilderness, I wasn't nearly as enthusiastic about spending nights in the woods without so much as a tent nearby. A few hikes here and there, sure, but an entire weekend away from civilization? That was his thing, not mine. "Yeah, maybe," I said, hoping that would be the end of it. But Andrew was persistent. Over the next few days, he sent me texts with pictures of pristine lakes, towering mountain peaks, and lush green forests. Every time, the caption was something like, "Imagine waking up to this," or "No cell service, just peace." It was hard not to feel a tug of curiosity. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress at work, and there was a part of me that wondered if maybe some time away from the noise of the city would help clear my head. After a week of relentless nudging, I caved. "Fine, let's do it. One weekend, though. I'm not quitting my job to become a mountain man," I joked. Andrew was thrilled. He immediately started planning. He knew of a spot deep in the national forest, miles away from the nearest road. It wasn't a well-marked trail, he warned, but he'd been there before with some college buddies. No tourists, no noise. Just the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional rustling of wildlife. We set the date for the last weekend of June. By then, the weather would be warm enough to camp comfortably but still cool enough at night to warrant a fire. Andrew assured me that he'd take care of all the logistics. The gear, the food, even the map. All I had to do was show up with a good pair of boots and a sense of adventure. The weeks leading up to the trip passed quickly. I tried not to think too much about it, focusing instead on wrapping up a big project at work. But as the date approached, a strange feeling settled over me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a vague unease. Maybe it was just the idea of being so far removed from civilization. Or maybe it was the way Andrew talked about the place, with a kind of reverence that bordered on obsession. A few days before we were set to leave, I received a package at my apartment. It was from Andrew, a brand new camping knife, sharp and sleek. Along with it was a note. "Figured you'd need this. See you Friday. Andrew." That night, as I held the knife in my hand, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was heading into something I wasn't quite prepared for. But I pushed the thought away. It was just a camping trip. How bad could it be? Friday morning came and I met Andrew at his place. He was already packed and ready to go, his truck loaded with gear. He handed me a cup of coffee and grinned. "Ready for an adventure?" I nodded, still trying to shake off the remnants of sleep. We set off early, heading north out of the city. The traffic thinned as we left the suburbs behind, replaced by rolling hills and dense patches of trees. By midday, we'd reached the edge of the national forest. Andrew pulled off the highway and onto a narrow gravel road that wound its way deeper into the woods. As we drove, the trees closed in around us, tall and silent, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. There were no signs of other people, no other cars, no houses, not even the occasional hiker. It was just us and the wilderness. About an hour later, Andrew pulled the truck to a stop at a small clearing. There was no official parking area, just a patch of grass where the road ended. He shut off the engine and hopped out, stretching his arms above his head. "This is it," he said, gesturing to the dense forest in front of us. I stepped out of the truck and looked around. The air was crisp, with the faint scent of pine and earth. It was quiet too, unnervingly so. I was used to the constant hum of the city, the distant roar of traffic, the chatter of people. Here, there was nothing but the occasional rustle of leaves. Andrew tossed me a backpack and grinned. "Let's go." We set off into the woods, following a faint trail that quickly disappeared into the underbrush. Andrew seemed to know where he was going, though, and I trusted him to lead the way. The trees grew thicker as we walked, their branches forming a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The further we went, the quieter it became, until even the sounds of birds and insects faded into silence. After about 2 hours of hiking, we reached a small clearing by a stream. Andrew dropped his pack and stretched. "This is the spot," he said, looking around with satisfaction. I glanced around, feeling a little less certain. The clearing was small, surrounded by dense woods on all sides. The stream bubbled quietly nearby, its water clear and cold. It was peaceful, sure, but there was something about the isolation that made me uneasy. It felt like we were the only two people left in the world. We set up camp, pitching the tent and gathering wood for a fire. Andrew was in his element, moving with a practiced ease that came from years of outdoor experience. I, on the other hand, fumbled with the tent poles and nearly sliced my finger open while trying to cut kindling. As the sun began to set, the temperature dropped, and the woods grew darker. We lit the fire and sat around it, the flames casting flickering shadows on the trees. Andrew was in a good mood, talking about his plans to hike further into the forest the next day, to explore some old logging trails he'd heard about. But as the night wore on, a strange tension settled over me. The woods, so peaceful during the day, now felt oppressive, as if the trees were watching us. The fire crackled and popped, but beyond its light, the darkness seemed to press in, thick and impenetrable. At some point, Andrew noticed my unease. "Hey, you all right?" he asked, his voice low and calm. I shrugged, trying to play it off. "Yeah, it's quiet out here." He chuckled. "That's the whole point, man. No distractions. Just you and nature." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was a weight in the air, a tension that I couldn't explain. It felt like we weren't alone out here, like there was something lurking just beyond the edge of the firelight. And then, as if to confirm my fears, I heard it. A faint sound, barely audible over the crackling of the fire. It was distant at first, like the whisper of wind through the trees. But as I strained to listen, it grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The faint crunch of leaves, the subtle shift of weight on the forest floor. It could have been anything. Maybe a deer wandering nearby or the wind playing tricks on my ears. But as the sound grew more defined, my pulse quickened. I glanced at Andrew, hoping he'd noticed it too. But he was still staring at the fire, completely relaxed, sipping his beer. I didn't want to seem paranoid, so I didn't say anything right away. I just sat there, listening intently, trying to convince myself that it was nothing more than an overactive imagination. But then it happened again, clearer this time, definitely footsteps. "Did you hear that?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Andrew raised an eyebrow, looking at me with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "Hear what?" "That," I said, motioning toward the darkness beyond the firelight. "It sounds like someone's walking out there." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Come on, man. It's probably just an animal. We're in the middle of the woods. There's bound to be wildlife around." I nodded, trying to shake off the creeping sense of unease. He was probably right. After all, we were in the wilderness, miles from any road or town. It wasn't exactly uncommon for animals to be moving about at night. Still, the sound didn't feel natural. It wasn't the light, tentative steps of a deer or the rustling of small critters in the underbrush. It was heavier, deliberate, like the footsteps of a person. The fire flickered, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to dance and shift with every gust of wind. I stared into the darkness, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound, but all I could see was an endless expanse of trees, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Another crunch. This time, Andrew heard it too. He paused mid-sip, his brow furrowing. Slowly, he lowered the beer and stared into the forest. "You heard that, right?" I asked, feeling a knot tighten in my chest. "Yeah," he muttered, standing up and grabbing the flashlight from his pack. "Hold on." Andrew clicked on the flashlight and pointed it toward the trees. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but more trees and undergrowth. The forest stood still, eerily silent now, as if it were holding its breath, waiting. He swept the light across the clearing, scanning the edge of the woods. I stood up, my eyes following the beam, every muscle in my body tensed. The footsteps had stopped, and all that remained was the low crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the stream. "There's nothing out there," Andrew said finally, his voice calm but firm. "Probably just a raccoon or something. They can sound pretty loud when they're scurrying through the leaves." I didn't respond right away. Something about the way those footsteps had sounded, they were too precise, too human. I wanted to believe him, though. I didn't want to be the guy who freaked out over a noise in the woods. Andrew seemed to sense my unease. He turned off the flashlight and sat back down, giving me a reassuring smile. "Relax, man. It's all part of the experience. Nature at night can be kind of freaky, but there's nothing out there that's gonna hurt us." I nodded again, though the tension in my gut refused to loosen. I forced myself to sit back down, trying to focus on the warmth of the fire, the smell of the smoke, the sounds of the stream. But my ears kept straining for that sound again, the footsteps. For the next hour, nothing happened. We sat by the fire, talking about nothing in particular, though I could tell Andrew was trying to lighten the mood. He told a few stories from his previous camping trips, recounting run-ins with wild animals, once even a bear, which he'd managed to scare off with a flare. Eventually, we both started to relax again. The eerie silence of the forest seemed less menacing as the night wore on. By the time the fire had burned down to glowing embers, I felt foolish for having been so on edge. Andrew was right, this was just part of camping. The woods could play tricks on your mind if you weren't used to it. Around midnight, we decided to call it a night. Andrew tossed some dirt on the fire to extinguish it, and we retreated into the tent. The air inside was cool, and the sound of the stream provided a soothing backdrop as I crawled into my sleeping bag. "Tomorrow's gonna be a long day," Andrew said, his voice muffled by his own sleeping bag. "We'll get up early, hit the trails, and explore some of the old logging roads I told you about." I murmured something in agreement, already feeling the pull of sleep. The day had been long, and despite the earlier unease, I was exhausted. For a while, I lay there, listening to the soft rustling of the trees outside, the gentle burble of the stream, the occasional shifting of Andrew as he got comfortable in his sleeping bag. Slowly, my eyelids grew heavy, and the sounds of the forest faded into the background. Just as I was on the edge of sleep, I heard it again. Footsteps, louder this time, closer. My heart leaped into my throat, and my eyes snapped open. I lay there, frozen, listening. The footsteps were unmistakable now, slow, deliberate, circling the tent. My breath caught in my chest, and I strained to hear through the thin fabric walls. Andrew didn't move. He was already asleep, his breathing deep and steady. The footsteps stopped, just outside the tent. I didn't dare move. I didn't dare breathe. And then, from somewhere in the darkness, I heard it. A low, raspy whisper. I couldn't make out the words, if there were any, but the sound sent a chill racing down my spine. I wanted to wake Andrew, to scream, to run, but I was paralyzed with fear. For what felt like hours, I lay there, waiting for something, anything to happen. But nothing did. The footsteps never resumed. The whisper never came again. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and despite my fear, I drifted into an uneasy sleep. When I woke up the next morning, the forest was bathed in golden sunlight, and the air was filled with the sound of birds chirping. For a brief, blissful moment, I wondered if I had imagined the whole thing, a dream brought on by exhaustion and nerves. But then I saw it, just outside the tent, pressed into the soft earth, was a single unmistakable footprint. Human. I stared at the footprint, my heart hammering in my chest. It was undeniably human, a perfect imprint in the damp soil just a few feet from our tent. The morning sun cast long shadows across it, making the details clear. The shape of the heel, the arch, and the distinct toes. I knelt down slowly, touching the edge of the print with my fingers. It was fresh, too fresh. Andrew was still asleep, his soft snores the only sound beside the bubbling of the stream. I didn't want to wake him, didn't want to admit what I had heard and seen last night, but I also couldn't ignore the fact that someone had been walking around our campsite. I stood up and glanced around, scanning the edge of the clearing, hoping to catch some sign of movement or find more tracks. But there was nothing else, just the single footprint, as if whoever had made it had vanished into thin air. The woods were still, bathed in the peaceful glow of morning. It felt so incongruous with what I'd experienced just hours earlier, but that only made the lingering dread gnaw harder at my mind. I debated waking Andrew, but before I could make up my mind, I heard him stir behind me. He yawned loudly and stretched, the fabric of his sleeping bag rustling as he pushed it off and sat up. "Morning," he mumbled, rubbing his eyes. "Man, I slept like a rock. How about you?" I hesitated for a moment, then forced a smile. "Not bad," I lied, stepping away from the footprint. I wasn't sure why, but something in me didn't want to tell him just yet. Maybe it was embarrassment. Maybe I didn't want him to think I was freaking out over something that could still have a rational explanation. Andrew got up and stretched his arms over his head. "Looks like it's going to be a good day for hiking. Clear skies, not too hot." I nodded, trying to focus on his words and push the creeping anxiety to the back of my mind. But every time I glanced at the spot where the footprint was, my stomach twisted into tighter knots. We packed up camp after a quick breakfast of oatmeal and coffee. Andrew was his usual cheerful self, excited to hit the trails and explore the logging roads he had mentioned. I tried to match his enthusiasm, but the memory of the whisper and the sound of those footsteps kept flashing through my mind. By the time we had our packs on and were ready to head deeper into the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves made me flinch. It was as if the forest itself had come alive with unseen eyes, observing us from the shadows. We hiked for a couple of hours, following an overgrown trail that Andrew swore led to an old logging camp. The woods grew denser as we moved further from the clearing, the trees pressing in on all sides, their branches forming a thick canopy that blocked out much of the sunlight. The further we went, the more my unease grew. I tried to convince myself that it was just the isolation getting to me, that I wasn't used to being this far away from civilization, surrounded by nothing but wilderness. But the feeling of being watched never left me. About an hour into the hike, we came to a narrow ravine with a small stream running through it. Andrew paused at the edge, surveying the landscape. "We'll need to cross this," he said, pointing to a narrow section of the stream where the water was shallow. "The logging road should be just on the other side." I followed him down into the ravine, carefully stepping on the rocks to avoid slipping into the water. As we crossed, I glanced up at the ridge above us and froze. There, standing at the top of the ravine, was a figure. It was far enough away that I couldn't make out any details, just the vague shape of a person, tall and still, watching us from the edge of the tree line. My heart leapt into my throat, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. "Andrew," I whispered, my voice tight with fear. He was already on the other side of the stream, adjusting his pack. "What's up?" I didn't answer. I couldn't take my eyes off the figure. It stood motionless, like a shadow against the trees, too far away for me to tell if it was even real. But I knew it was. I could feel its gaze, cold and unblinking, fixed on me. "Andrew," I repeated louder this time. He turned and followed my gaze, but by the time he looked, the figure was gone. "What is it?" he asked, frowning. "What did you see?" I swallowed hard, trying to keep my voice steady. "There was someone up there, watching us." Andrew squinted at the ridge, scanning the tree line. "I don't see anything." "They were just there," I insisted, my pulse racing. "I saw them." Andrew stared at me for a moment, then let out a slow breath. "All right, listen. I know you didn't sleep well last night, and it's easy to get jumpy out here, especially when you're not used to being in the woods. But there's no one out here, man. We're miles from any trailhead, and the only people who come this far are hardcore backpackers. They wouldn't be lurking around like that." I wanted to believe him. I really did. But the image of the figure standing at the ridge was burned into my mind. I knew what I'd seen. Andrew clapped a hand on my shoulder, giving me a reassuring smile. "Come on, let's get moving. The sooner we get to the logging road, the better. It's probably just your mind playing tricks." Reluctantly, I nodded and followed him up the other side of the ravine, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. The figure was real, I knew it, and whoever it was, they were watching us. We continued hiking for another hour or so, the forest growing more dense and tangled with each step. The path became harder to follow, and Andrew had to check the map more frequently. But as we pressed on, my mind kept wandering back to that figure on the ridge. Were they still following us, hidden among the trees? Finally, we reached the old logging road. It was little more than a wide, overgrown trail now, its surface cracked and covered in weeds. The remnants of an old, rotting fence lined one side, and further down the road, I could see the collapsed remains of what might have once been a small cabin or shed. Andrew seemed pleased. This is it. The old logging camp's just up ahead. Should be some cool stuff to check out. But as we moved forward, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There, in the soft dirt of the road, were more footprints. Fresh, human, and they were heading in the same direction we were. The sight of the footprints stopped me cold. They were fresh, the edges still sharp in the damp dirt, and they followed the same path we were on. My skin prickled with a deep, primal sense of danger. Someone had been here not long ago, and they were heading deeper into the woods, just like us. Andrew noticed my hesitation and followed my gaze down to the footprints. He crouched down to inspect them, his expression growing more serious by the second. "Ha!" he muttered, his fingers tracing the edge of one of the prints. "These weren't here last time I came through." I stared at him, my heart racing. Someone's been following us. Andrew stood up slowly, dusting his hands off on his pants. He didn't laugh this time. He didn't try to reassure me with a smile or a joke. He just looked down the trail, the same uneasy feeling I had now creeping into his features. "I don't like this," he said finally, his voice low. "But it could just be another hiker. Maybe they took a different route and circled around." I shook my head, the unease turning into dread. "We haven't seen anyone, Andrew. And last night, those footsteps around our camp, it's the same person." Andrew was silent for a moment, his eyes scanning the tree line as if expecting someone to step out at any moment. The peaceful serenity of the woods now felt hostile. Every shadow, every flicker of movement between the trees a potential threat. "All right," he said finally, his voice tense. "We're not sticking around to find out. Let's head back to the truck. We'll cut through the woods instead of following the trail. I know a faster route." He didn't wait for me to argue, and honestly, I didn't want to. My instincts were screaming at me to leave, to get out of these woods as fast as possible. Andrew led the way, moving quickly but cautiously, his eyes darting from side to side, scanning the undergrowth for any signs of movement. We veered off the trail, pushing through dense brush and undergrowth. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees growing thicker, the light dimming as the sky overhead turned a dull, overcast gray. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a twig made my pulse jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that the person who had left those footprints was still following us, somewhere in the shadows. We hiked in silence for what felt like hours, my legs burning from the effort of navigating the uneven terrain. Andrew was leading us with confidence, but I could tell he was tense, too. He'd glance back every now and then, his jaw clenched, his eyes narrowed. We weren't lost, but we weren't alone either. Just when I thought we might be nearing the clearing where we'd parked, I heard it again, the footsteps. They were distant at first, barely audible over the sound of our own movement, but they grew louder, closer. Whoever it was, they were no longer trying to hide. The steady crunch of leaves and snapping of twigs followed us, unrelenting. It was a sound I'd heard before back at the camp circling the tent, and now it was here, in the daylight, chasing us through the woods. I stopped, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. Andrew froze too, his hand instinctively going to the knife strapped to his belt. "Do you hear that?" I whispered, my voice tight with fear. Andrew nodded, his face pale. "Yeah, I hear it." For the first time since the trip started, Andrew looked scared. He reached into his pack and pulled out a flare gun, something I hadn't seen him pack before. He cocked it, holding it tightly in his hand as he scanned the woods. "Let's move," he whispered. "Now." We broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, the sound of footsteps growing louder behind us. My heart was pounding in my chest, my legs burning as I pushed myself to keep up with Andrew. Branches slapped at my face, thorns tore at my clothes, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting out of the woods. The footsteps were closer now, too close. Whoever it was, they were gaining on us. Suddenly, Andrew skidded to a stop in front of me, grabbing my arm and pulling me down behind a large fallen log. He raised the flare gun, aiming it in the direction of the sound. For a moment, the woods were silent. All I could hear was the pounding of my heart in my ears, my ragged breathing. Then, slowly, the footsteps came to a stop. I strained to listen, my body trembling with fear. The footsteps were just on the other side of the log, maybe 10 feet away, but whoever it was, they weren't moving anymore. The silence was suffocating. Andrew held up a hand, signaling for me to stay down. He raised the flare gun a little higher, his finger on the trigger. I held my breath, every muscle in my body tensed, waiting for something, anything, to happen. And then, from the other side of the log, we heard it. A voice, low, raspy, barely more than a whisper. "I see you." Before I could react, Andrew fired the flare gun, the bright red flare arcing through the air, lighting up the forest in a burst of red. The moment it fired, there was a deafening scream, high-pitched and unnatural, like the sound of someone in agony. The figure, whoever it was, bolted into the woods, their footsteps receding into the distance. Andrew didn't waste a second. "Run!" he shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me up. We ran harder than we'd ever run before, the trail ahead of us blurring as adrenaline took over. The flare had lit up the woods, casting long, eerie shadows, but there was no time to think about what we'd just seen or heard. We just had to get out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we broke through the trees and stumbled into the clearing where we'd parked the truck. Andrew didn't stop. He fumbled with his keys, throwing open the door and practically shoving me inside before jumping into the driver's seat. The engine roared to life and we sped out of the clearing, the tires kicking up dirt and gravel as we tore down the narrow road. Neither of us spoke for a long time. We were both shaking, our faces pale, our minds racing. It wasn't until we were miles away from the forest, the trees thinning and the road widening into something more familiar, that Andrew finally broke the silence. "I don't know what the hell that was," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "but we're never coming back here. Ever." I nodded, my throat too tight to speak. We didn't look back. We didn't talk about it again. But for weeks afterward, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the footsteps, the slow, deliberate crunch of leaves, and that voice, "I see you."